Story 1. Trash bin full of rotten chicken baking in the blistering Texas summer sun, with a hint of dirty diapers from a sick toddler mixed in. Story 2. I have a job where I go into people's houses. Last week, I did a job for the city to help condemn a house for unsafe living conditions. This man lived in his home for 40 years, never cleaned once, had multiple plumbing leaks, and never fixed them. He had more than 2 inches of mold growing on the tile. He had 14 cats and never threw away the litter. He stacked the old litter in a bedroom, and the whole bedroom was about 3 feet high with used litter. He was a chain smoker and tossed all his used cigarette butts in the closet for decades. The house was incredibly filthy and disgusting. The smell was intolerable. I wore a serious mask and still couldn't handle it. To make it worse, he was a trash diving hoarder, meaning he would literally dive in trash cans, find items, and hoard them in his house. He is still living in the house, but the city is going to condemn it. It was the most disgusting thing I have ever seen and smelled in my life. Story 3. Worked as an emergency medical technician. Dead bodies are unpleasant. Before working as an emergency medical technician, I worked on the night crew at a large retail store. While driving a forklift, a coworker threw a 3 or 4-day-old dead rat we found under my wheels as a joke. I heard it pop, and the smell made most of us on the crew vomit. Story 4. Disney replaced the Alien experience with a Lilo and Stitch attraction. Instead of a scary experience of the alien breaking out, it featured Stitch. At one point, he burps a chilly dog or something, and they spray an unpleasant smell. I had long hair, and the smell got stuck in it all day. Walking around in the hot Florida sun all day, it was very unpleasant. Story 5. Anal gland secretions from my cat. I cannot even begin to describe that smell and how bad it is. Fortunately, it does not happen often. Story 6. Hands down. Rotting grass that had been sitting for several months. That one made me vomit immediately, so it feels the most putrid in my memory. Burning hair is bad. Burning skin is bad. These are sharp smells that linger in your nose, so they are the worst for a different reason. I am guessing that our friends in the medical field will surpass most posts here. Those brave souls in the intensive care unit have my respect. Story 7. I'm a nurse, so there are too many to describe, but I will let another nurse describe some of the things we encounter. Ladies and gentlemen, I hereby present the swamps of Dagoba. Story 8. One time, I was reading in bed next to my sleeping wife. I farted badly, a real silent but deadly one. She woke up cursing and said it smelled so bad that it seeped into her dream. I woke my wife from a deep sleep with the horrible smell of a fart. I am laughing while typing just from the memory. Story 9. During a high school bus trip, they did not have the proper permits for our destination, resulting in several extra days of driving. The chemical toilet at the back became too full and began fermenting, creating a terrible smell. Someone attempted to mask it with vanilla-scented body spray, but the two odors combined into a horrible stench. To this day, the artificial vanilla scent makes me dry heave. Story 10. I was pledging a fraternity at a large state university when they ordered us to clean the basement, which included a kitchen unit that had not been used in a long time. At one point, someone knocked over a garbage pail, and the liquid that came out smelled like a combination of rotten milk and vomit. We all ran out of the basement and never returned. We all quit pledging before initiation, and the fraternity lost their charter shortly after. Story 11. Doing search and rescue during Hurricane Katrina, I saw a refrigerator lying in the middle of the road. For some reason, I decided to open it up to check it out. Turns out that was a terrible mistake. If you are ever in a similar situation, do not do it. Story 12. Mine is not as bad as others, but we got a new dog and my wife is out of town, so he was my responsibility. He got into the cat room and ate cat feces without me knowing. Long story short, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning to his diarrhea. It was not the sound that woke me up, but the smell. Story 13. Sailing from Bristol Bay to Kodiak with a load of salmon. I came across a dead, bloated, decomposing walrus with tusks intact. I threw a line around its head. It stunk too badly to bring aboard, so I proceeded to tow our prize toward Kodiak. About 12 hours from town, we encountered a tailwind that made the air unbearable. We cut the line and sailed onward. Story 14. I was in the very early stages of pregnancy and felt nauseous all the time, almost gagging. I wasn't ready to tell anyone I was pregnant. This was early August. I flew across the country to the East Coast for my grandmother's funeral, where all my extended family was present. As you do when you travel from a landlocked province to one by the sea and see your family, we bought a lot of seafood and ate it all. Lobsters, oysters, mussels. Glorious. This province has a composting program, so all the shells went into the compost bin to await pickup. It was very hot. August in Cape Breton, so the shells spoiled quickly. I threw up twice during my pregnancy. The first time was at my uncle's house after carrying that seafood bucket. Coincidentally, I also vomited on my cousin's feet when she found out I was pregnant. Good times. Story 15. The only time I ever vomited from a smell was when I worked as a groundskeeper for a university. I was responsible for keeping a pond on campus clean, and there was a large dead turtle decomposing in warm, shallow water. I had to pull it out, bag it, and transport it in the bed of my truck. When I grabbed a leg or tail, old dead turtle skin slipped off. It was leaking unpleasant fluids everywhere. The smell was unbearable. I vomited several times. Story 16. The person next to me on the bus on my college campus smelled like a mixture of rotten eggs and gasoline. Story 17. We had a freezer that went bad while we were on vacation. When we got back, it had probably been off for over a week in a hot garage. The 25 pounds of deer meat in it had turned into a puddle of goo, and the smell was ghastly. I had to set the freezer out on the curb for several days until sanitation picked it up. Even with the lid shut, you could still smell it from the front porch. Story 18. My roommate got a big turkey from his work for Christmas. We lived in Australia, so it was very hot during the peak summer at that time of year. I was on holiday and would not be home for about 3 weeks. He was also going to visit his family in another city the day after he received the turkey, so he did not have time to cook it. The bird was so big that it could not fit in the fridge. He forgot about it and left it on the kitchen counter in the middle of summer. For weeks. The smell was so bad when I got home that I considered burning the house down. Story 19. Farmhand checking in. I was out with the foreman one day checking cattle on a 900-acre farm. I can't remember how many cattle were out there. Probably a couple of hundred. There was no way to do a head count except for the twice-yearly roundup. Basically, we just rode across the property looking for obvious trouble. We did not find trouble, we smelled it. The week before, a batch of thunderstorms had passed through the area. At some point, a heifer had been drinking from a spring and was struck by a bolt of lightning. That was what we smelled, probably from 100 yards away. Charred flesh has a unique smell. It is not the pleasant smell of a steak on the grill, although lightning basically cooks a living body from the inside out. Flesh that has been decomposing in water for several days also has a unique smell. Those who have smelled both can likely appreciate what I am talking about. Being the lowest ranking, I was sent to investigate. Then I was sent to wrap a chain around what was left of a back leg so we could pull the carcass out of the water with the pickup. We did not want to let the carcass contaminate the drinking water for the rest of the herd. As best as I can remember, we dragged the body into a patch of woods and left her. That is one of the few times I was glad I smoked. I quit a few years ago. I once read that soldiers who fought in the Battle of Verdun were issued extra cigarettes to help ward off the stench of the dead. A Marlboro Red really does help at times like that. I would have vomited otherwise. Story 20. Detroit Dog Pound built to house 150 dogs. They told us they were currently sheltering 300. The urine smell hit you when you walked in the front door and got worse the deeper into the building you went. We picked our girl from there but took her directly to the self-service dog baths before taking her home. Story 21. I worked in a tannery that turns cowhide into leather. The chemicals used, along with the hair and other materials, smell so bad that the waste storage is located hundreds of yards from the plant. Some years ago, a maintenance worker died instantly after walking into a tank and inhaling the fumes. Story 22. I was in the hospital for a week. On day 4, everyone on that floor started having bowel movements again. The nurses put out cotton balls soaked with peppermint oil to mask the terrible smell. It did not help. The odor from a dozen patients whose digestion started to work again was very bad. I am sure a dead body would smell worse, but there was no such luck finding one. Story 23. In Tennessee, I worked for a construction and real estate company. One of their houses that was being rented was abandoned by the tenants. I was sent to check on it and found the remains equivalent to 37 bags of decomposed dogs. This became known as the Hulbig animal cruelty case. Story 24. Melina is basically bleeding in the upper intestinal tract. Your stool smells like rotten food, death, old blood, and a severe infection all at once. Your stool looks like something crawled into your rectum 7 weeks ago and died twice. I have a strong stomach, but during that shift, I nearly vomited. Story 25. I was driving and ended up near a dump truck hauling cow carcasses, likely going to the dog food plant, and it was putrid. I stopped at a light, and the smell entered my car even with the recirculation fan set to inside air. The surprising part was that I thought I saw a skull fall out of the dump truck onto the road, but maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The smell stayed in my nose for a couple of hours and felt like it was on my clothes. Story 26. A jar contained an egg, soaked in vinegar long enough to dissolve the shell but retain the membrane. The vinegar was then removed and replaced with urine, and the jar was left out in the inland San Diego sun for a week. Story 27. One time, while working the mandatory overnight shift at a hospital to attain my emergency medical technician certifications, a homeless man came in after drinking 4 40-ounce malt beers. He emitted a very unpleasant odor. I was overwhelmed, but the nurses were not affected. I proceeded to identify the worst smell they had ever encountered. It was unanimously described as putrid flesh from rotting sores. Story 28. A mentally disabled man's father died. He did not know what to do since it was just the two of them living alone in the neighborhood. He left his father's body on the floor, locked the room, and went about his business. It was summertime, and a week later, the smell of the dead body spread down the street. Someone called the police, and they got the disabled man to admit that his father was deceased and decomposing upstairs. I had the opportunity to visit the crime scene. The foul odor was overwhelming, making it difficult to breathe without feeling nauseous. I spent most of the day with a group of experienced detectives who did not react to the smell, as they collected the father's blackened and partially liquefied remains into a body bag. Story 29. I was asked to help empty a garbage can of water that had been filling since late fall. It was mid-spring and did not seem that bad until I realized there was a dead, rotting raccoon corpse at the bottom. I lost every meal I ate for the past week when we dumped it and retched for a good 6 hours whenever I remembered it. Even now, years later, just remembering that smell makes me want to vomit again. Story 30. A chicken barn had an exhaust fan failure when the temperature reached 105 degrees. The fan failed on Friday, and it was discovered on Monday. Story 31. I had a pilonidal cyst that abscessed and then burst open to the outside of my body. I cannot even describe the smell. Story 32. The town I lived in for a while had a dog food processing plant, a cheese factory, and a sugar beet plant that made small packets of sugar. Waking up hungover on a Saturday morning when all the plants were operating was challenging. Good luck holding on to the contents of your stomach. It was unique. Story 33. 2 stand out. A dead body has a very distinct smell. The second is a dead rat that climbed onto the radiator of my truck to get warm one night. Unfortunately for the rat, that night a freak ice storm hit, so it froze. Once it thawed enough for us to drive, I guess it slowly thawed. We didn't smell anything yet. The next day there was a hint of the smell, so we kept looking inside the car, wondering if someone left food in there by accident or something, but found nothing. Flash forward a few days later. Now the rat is almost fully thawed because the temperature jumped more than 15 degrees. We hadn't driven the car because we stayed at the house. We turned on the air conditioning and heater and were hit with the second worst smell ever. We ran out gagging, turned the car off, Pop the hood, and voila. Story 34. I worked as a bag and tagger for a while, which involves picking up deceased persons after the paramedics and police finish at the scene. On the first day, we had a job at a suburban house to collect an older deceased man who was house-sitting while the family was overseas. He had fallen, hit his head, and passed away for weeks prior. Neighbors alerted the police due to the smell. Entering the house was next level. Pools of bodily fluid were all around the body, and the skin was coming off in thick layers as we tried to pick him up. I did not do that job long because I was going to start my thesis in a few months. The man I worked with had been doing it for a decade and had some pretty crazy stories. Story 35. I had a summer job in college emptying storage units of people who didn't pay their bills and left all their belongings behind. One particular unit was used as a garbage dump. It contained weeks or months of kitchen trash bags, rotting away in the heat of summer for a long time. As soon as we lifted the door, the air brought the smell from the unit to our noses, and let me tell you, it is surprising how the body can react to something like that. The smell made my body spin around involuntarily. It was a wretched smell, but the idea of a smell making my body move on its own is the memory I kept from that day. Story 36. In my hometown on an island in New Brunswick, Canada, we have a bridge that leads out of town. During the summer, algae of all kinds would pile up against the bridge. When the tide went down, the algae would dry up and rot in the sun, along with whatever was caught in it. The combined scent of decay, gas, and vomit was present every time we drove on that bridge. The stench is indescribable. We knew to shut down all ventilation in the car. Story 37. Month-old corpse and eucalyptus. It was not the most intensely horrendous smell I have ever encountered, but it stayed with me longer than anything else, and I am sure that is partly psychological. I was 17 and an explorer on the local search and rescue team. A young man had been murdered, and his body dumped in a eucalyptus grove, coincidentally on my best friend's grandparents' property, where it had been for weeks. I arrived shortly after the coroner had taken the body away, and there was just a black puddle in the leaf litter. I was the only one experienced with a metal detector, or the only one who would admit to it. For 2 days, I searched that area repeatedly, digging up every roofing nail, soda can, and oil filter as we tried to find the knife used in the murder. The knife was found over a mile away. I wish I had known then about the trick of putting Vicks under your nose to block the smell. Eucalyptus still reminds me of that search. Story 38. I worked on an old truck that had blown both the coolant transmission barrier in the radiator and the coolant oil barriers in the head. The truck mixed all that up and then severely overheated. It was severely damaged. Story 39. The dog escaped and ate something that had been dead for a while, then came inside and vomited in the kitchen. Half-rotted and chewed organs with stomach fluid is something I will not forget. Story 40. A coworker had an unpleasant odor. We placed her in an office with a large industrial fan blowing the air out of the room, and she was not allowed to attend any meetings. It was the worst smell imaginable. Story 41. I used to work for the waste management company and had to go to a landfill. However, the worst smell was picking up a slaughterhouse trash, and the next stop was a seafood place. Story 42. Rotting flesh. I have been in healthcare nearly my whole life. The first time was early in my career at 17 years old. Story 43. I had a friend who worked overnight at the Cook County morgue, and I wanted to check it out. While I was there one hot, humid Chicago night, they brought in the body of a neighborhood cat lady who had died a few days earlier. The cats had started eating her, and her face was nearly entirely gone. My friend was wearing Drakkar Noir. Story 44. When I was 8, I ran up the stairs, and the cat happened to be running ahead of me. I decided to scare it. I went HH. A shot of something came out of its backside and hit my uvula. It was the worst, most rancid thing I have ever experienced and tasted even worse. That memory is 30 years old, and I can still smell it in my mind. It was worse than the 6-month jars my friends and I used to make and leave at each other's houses. Food, drinks, saliva, sometimes animal feces, all in a mason jar hidden away somewhere, and 6 months later we would text the location. Sometimes parents would find the jars first and open them. Once a friend's dad was moving a shelf in the garage and knocked a half-dozen jars onto the concrete. The whole house was almost unlivable while a professional cleaner dealt with it. Cat excrement was worse than that. Story 45. My son's dog had rolled in something dead. I immediately vomited, which made room for my daughter-in-law's ambrosia. Story 46. Cannot say it is the worst, but differential fluid smells like a decomposing dinosaur with athlete's foot. It is quite unpleasant. Story 47. Sinus infection. I had a tiny pinhole in my gum that did not fully close after oral surgery, and it became infected deep inside. Occasionally, pressure would force water or fluid into the hole, and when it did, I would get a disgusting rotten egg stench inside my face, like I could not escape the smell because it was inside my skull. It was absolutely unbearable for 3 days of my life. Story 48. I still don't know exactly what it was, but it was in a subway car. I used to live in Toronto, and one time I was waiting for the subway during rush hour. It's hard to find a comfortable place to stand in the Toronto subway sometimes. The train would pull in, and every car was packed with people like sardines, every car except one. It was totally empty. You fools! I thought as I stepped into the empty car, preparing myself to enjoy all the elbow room you could possibly want. The doors shut. Then the smell hit me. It was a thick smell, the kind you can't escape by breathing through your mouth. You could almost taste it. It made the air feel different. If you took a whiff, you could feel it rub past your soft palate like you were breathing rough air. I have tried to think of how to describe it, but honestly, the only thing I can say is it was like hair that had never been washed, corduroy that had never been cleaned but worn daily, sand, spices, despair, and somehow not really body odor. I just don't know what it was. The train car was empty and it smelled like this. I still think about that day and wonder. I lasted the one stop, trying my best not to breathe. I stepped off and waited for the next train. Story 49. While doing roadside cleanup for Boy Scouts years ago, I had the misfortune to discover that someone had dumped hundreds of pounds of pig manure along the side of the road and then covered it with gravel to hide it. It had baked in the sun and looked like just a little slope to the side of the road. It ultimately became a thin, solid layer over a pile of semi-liquid filth. How do I know? Well, I took a step on it to retrieve some trash, and breaking the crust on top was like unleashing the final lock to the gates of hell. I sank in up to my calf and thanked all the gods that I was wearing muck boots. It was a physical assault on my senses, and it coated my boots so thoroughly that we just left my boots there to pick up and throw out later after they had dried. I almost immediately started vomiting everywhere, and the smell was so bad you couldn't even detect an undertone of recent vomit. So if you've never smelled old yet still semi-liquid pig excrement that has been baking and fermenting in the July sun, count yourself blessed. I can still remember that smell. Story 50. While moving out during the pandemic, we were hauling things wearing full masks in the heat of summer. It was very unpleasant. I was living in an apartment complex, and on moving day, there was the smell of rotting meat. It was so foul that my friends and I were gagging all day. I came back a day or two later to grab a package that was sent to me and saw an ambulance parked there. One of the neighbors told me the woman across the hall had killed herself about a week ago and had barricaded herself in her apartment. The smell of a decaying corpse is the worst I have had to experience. Story 51. Lactulose bowel movements. I was a young nursing student. It was Valentine's Day. A patient on lactulose continually had bowel movements all over the bed, from the pillow to the socks. I really felt for her because she needed the medication, and this was a side effect. The stench lingered in my nose. It was just similar enough to a food smell that all cooked food smelled like stool to me for 2 days afterward. I only ate cereal. Story 52. I used to work at a huge corn processing plant. There was a large tank holding sweet water after it was used to wash special cornstarch. Under the tank was a concrete basin about 50 by 50 feet to catch spills from the tank. It was very shallow, only a few inches deep, with a drain in the middle. The tank spilled and filled the basin with about 3 inches of wastewater. The drain was closed, so the water just sat there. After a couple of days, mold grew across the entire surface. It formed a thick, chunky layer that began to decay as it grew thicker. They sent me in to open the drain, which was operated from the drain itself, right in the middle of the basin. I put on rubber boots and a respirator and went out. The respirator did little to block the intense stench from the rotting mold mat, and my waiting made it much worse. The two people with me ran to the truck and drove 50 yards away. I opened the drain and got to the edge before ripping off my mask and vomiting intensely. They pulled the truck up, left the boots, and helped me out of there. Story 53. We had backyard hens. One of them laid an egg in the compost pile and it got buried. A year or two later, it was unearthed while I was digging. I tried to gently move it out with my shovel, but as soon as I touched it, it exploded like a firecracker. Bang! My wife was at the other end of the yard and said, "What was that?" Before I could answer, the smell hit me. Imagine rotten egg mixed with death and toxic waste. It was so strong we couldn't even be outside until it had dispersed. We went in and closed all the windows. I don't know what kind of gas and chemicals had been brewing in there, but it was unlike any of the usual rotten smells. Story 54. Dead bodies that had been frozen over the winter. When spring came, they washed into a river and got tangled in barbed wire. We had to release some of them to free them from the wire. Story 55. An aftermath of a deceased person while doing a cleanup. The poor person died in bed, and nobody saw him for months. The bed had a perfect person-shaped hole in the foam mattress. Bluebottle flies and maggots were everywhere with a sickly sweet smell. I had to rub Vaseline inside my nose to block the smell and wear the full protective outfit. That was about 20 years ago and still haunts me to this day. The only way we could find out when the person died was by the newspapers in the hallway. By the date, it was about 8 months. Story 56. Leg wounds. A person came into the clinic, and I had the opportunity to unwrap and rewrap them. The room smelled like that for the rest of the day. Story 57. When I was a teenager working a light factory job to make college money, I had to clean out one of the threading machines. This involved water, oil, and metal shavings. On a hot August day, the water and oil mixture spoils, and you have to scoop out all the congealed mess from the base. It takes about 30 minutes, and when you first get in there, you have to hold back the gag reflex. After college, I lived with some friends. One day, we noticed a smell near the fence around the property. One of my roommates and I went to investigate. When the smell became really bad, like rotting food, we found the source. Some foil-wrapped fish, as if someone had caught it. Opening it released a wave of rotten fish and maggots. We got a shovel, pitched it into a trash can, poured gasoline on it, and burned it. Story 58. My uncle was a loner. He passed away approximately 2 weeks prior. While they disposed of the body, the remains of the decomposition were still present. It was memorable. This occurred in 2019 at the height of the pandemic. Many things happened then. The smell, 2 dead dogs as well, the house. To this day, it is the worst smell I have ever experienced. Not many people get to smell a decaying corpse. I, for one, hope never to smell that again. On a lighter note, the second and third worst smells happened in the same house, different from the first story. I had to babysit my 2-year-old cousin. As you can guess, his diaper contained green feces. I almost hurled when I smelled it, which is not normal for me. I did not have to with the first story because I was expecting it, but with this child, I did not expect it. The same house also has many cats and dogs that urinate inside. It reeks of urine in that place. I have to change my clothes after visiting just to remove the smell. Story 59. Inside the parking garage at the Barbary Coast Casino, when it was still open in Las Vegas, there were decades of urine that had festered and rotted. The smell overtook my nose, and I had to get out of there in a hurry. Story 60. My old job had a waterless urinal in the men's room. There was a hole filled by a canister that the urine filtered through. That device often got clogged, and I had the unpleasant task of fixing it. I used a special tool to remove the canister, and the smell from the hole was unbearable. It coated my throat and nostrils, and the odor was so intense that we had to close the lobby until it dissipated. The smell lingered for about 3 hours. Story 61. Rotting seafood in the middle of summer. I was helping clean out an old freezer that had lost power weeks earlier. When we opened it, the stench hit like a physical punch. This sour, putrid, stomach-turning wave that clung to your clothes and hair for days. I gagged so hard I saw stars. Story 62. When I was about 14, we visited the horticulture department at a local university because they had a Titan arum that was blooming. Titan arum, also known as the corpse flower. Story 63. This person, who lived in the dorm next to the elevators, either had a skin condition or a mental condition and never showered. They smelled absolutely foul. Every day, I would hold my breath walking past their dorm to the point where I wasn't sure why I continued doing it. One day, out of curiosity, I decided to take a whiff of air as I walked by. As soon as I did, the sharp, pungent smell struck my nostrils. It was a sour odor mixed with musk that was utterly foul. I ran to my dorm and gasped for air. I do not know exactly what it smelled like, but I know how it made me feel. Story 64. Got stuck driving behind the pickup truck, carrying 20 to 30 rotten animal carcasses that had been exposed to the summer heat. The road was too narrow to pass for about 5 miles. Story 65. Took a dead horse to the rendering facility for livestock. It was probably worse since it was summer and 105 degrees outside. You cannot imagine a worse smell. Story 66. Certain parts of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina smelled like literal death. Not roadkill, but a far worse, brutal smell that haunts me to this day. Story 67. I spent a decade working with animals, including farm animals. I encountered many smells, including the scent of death. However, the worst odor I ever experienced was that of badly spoiled black beans. Story 68. Something was leaking from a box at work that got on my hands. Based on descriptions I found online, it may have been isovaleric acid or butyric acid. The smell was horrible, worse than the smell of death. It smelled like the most sour, disgusting body odor imaginable, but 5 times stronger, with a hint of artificial cheese flavoring. I took one small sniff of my hand, and the smell just got worse until I almost wanted to cry and vomit at the same time. I walked to the bathroom, gagging the whole way, to wash my hands, but they still smelled even after washing thoroughly. Story 69. Lime sulfur. When my dog vomited what she ate, including rotting roadkill. Mentally ill or low-functioning overweight adults who do not wash themselves or brush their teeth. Also, when I had dry socket, the worst pain and the worst smell, especially since it is your own breath. Story 70. I had a protein shake in the back seat of my car in a Stanley container, long forgotten and left to bake in the summer heat for months. A friend opened it out of morbid curiosity, and it released the most awful stench that has stuck with me to this day. Story 71. A stinkhorn mushroom. I had stumbled onto it as a kid. It smells like a dead animal that has been rotting in the sun. Sweet, rotten, and metallic. It stinks to attract flies, apparently. Story 72. The smell of a defrosted evidence refrigerator that held a goat head in it for years. There was zero chance of that smell ever being removed. Story 73. 29 Palms, California. Half the base smelled like burning waste and the other half smelled like raw sewage. It was not a pleasant duty station. Story 74. Gorilla exhibit at Animal Kingdom in Disney World. I have a strong sense of smell, and the urine odor was so strong that I nearly vomited. Story 75. When I was a kid, I worked with my uncle on a produce farm over the summer. One day, while picking green peppers, we were tossing the occasional pepper up in the air for the other to hit. Thinking about it now, it may very well have been a setup from the start because one of those peppers made contact with my fist with no resistance. It melted up my arm and into my face. He had thrown a rotten pepper at me. As far as I can remember, that was the only time I have ever thrown up from a smell. It was unpleasant. A close second is mucking out the pit under a car wash with a shovel and hip waders. This was only done once a year. I did not throw up that time. Story 76. I work in fire safety and regularly inspect apartments, care homes, and other facilities with fire alarm systems. In aged care homes, death is unfortunately quite common. Facilities focused on independent living rather than assisted living sometimes do not discover a death for a short period. This occasionally comes to light during an annual fire inspection. There is nothing worse than encountering a several-day-old, decomposing human body. I believe there is a psychological aspect that makes it even more distressing. I hope I never have to experience that smell again. Story 77. 6-day-old floater. I had a job where I needed to be in the hospital morgue frequently, so I was experienced with the smell of dead people. This was orders of magnitude worse. Story 78. A container of oysters that were on the back of a shelf and had been opened about 2 weeks before I found them. They were all dark blue. Story 79. Green beans on a 626 bean picker hydraulic pump, cooked to smelly mush under a cover of months of dust and bean leaves. Put me off green beans for a few years. Story 80. My childhood neighbor was an elderly collector, and her horse died in midsummer. It was not moved for several days. Story 81. My friend once asked me if I wanted to smell the worst thing ever. I said no, so I guess I will never know. Story 82. I've had the misfortune of smelling many dead, decaying things, fecal matter, slipping clutches, dying electronics, and foul chemicals in my time. But the worst thing I have ever smelled was a 50-amp energy direct current to direct current/maximum power point tracking charger experiencing a catastrophic meltdown. The odor lingered for weeks even after it was removed and given plenty of time to air out. There is something about the black plastic they use that is beyond awful. Story 83. Bratwursts that were left in my recreational vehicle freezer over the summer, not turned on or anything. I gagged upon finding them and continued to gag on my way to the trash. Then came the difficult task of cleaning the freezer. It was a major chore, but we eventually removed the smell. Story 84. After being away from home for a week, I found a pool of fur, bones, and maggots that was once a possum in my garage. It had been in the 90s that week, and that smell will be cemented in my mind for as long as I am still on this earth. Story 85. I used to date a woman whose son was a high school football player. He would dump his used gear in the entryway right inside the front door. I am not easily disgusted. I can handle some pretty foul stuff. That, however, was too much for me. She was a good woman and the child was good otherwise. Story 86. When the freezer failed in our new pet cremation company in a 12 by 20-foot uninsulated building in July in the Mid-South, I discovered it 2 days later. Story 87. Had a patient who was found lying in her own waste for 3 days. The skin on her hand was essentially peeling off due to prolonged exposure to moisture. Needless to say, there was a strong odor. Story 88. An open can of rotting half-eaten dog food that my brother hid under our bed. We were young and not in the best living conditions, and he would eat what he could to avoid being hungry. This was back in the late 1990s when things were produced very differently than they are now. Story 89. My brother-in-law is a veterinarian, and I walked into his office while he was operating on a female dog with deceased puppies inside her. The smell of death was overpowering. Just awful. Story 90. I was a butcher years ago. I worked for a company that raised a specific breed of pig and fed them a special diet. I was at the processing facility breaking down the animals when I cut into a cyst deep in a muscle on one shoulder. The animal was cold, but the cyst was hot. It sliced open and released a pale green substance that was steaming. The smell filled the room, and everyone caught it and quickly left through the door into the hall. It filled the hallway as well and made all of us gag badly. We could not get the smell out of the room and had to finish the afternoon with it lingering. It reminded me of the color of mint chocolate chip ice cream from when I was a kid. I cannot eat ice cream anymore because I feel like I smell it again if I try. Story 91. A river turtle was crossing a busy highway, so my wife and I pulled over to take it back to the river. The smell will forever linger in my nose. Story 92. I live in Arkansas, and there are chicken houses everywhere. They are definitely offensive to the nose. Story 93. In a less horrifying example, I bought some supposed ginger candy from an Asian market. Came in a clear plastic box and looked tasty. When you opened it and smelled it, the odor was very unpleasant. I kept it just to surprise the unsuspecting with, "Hey, what does this smell like?" Story 94. My college mini fridge broke, and I only noticed after grabbing milk that was far from expiring. That being said, it cannot compare to cleaning out my roommate's part of the fridge after he moved out in May. I found a carton that expired before Thanksgiving. I put on a mask before dealing with that one. Story 95. Went to someone's house for a call, and they had dead animals and giant human-sized feces all over the floor. Story 96. I don't even know how to describe the smell, but I was working for a moving company, and we were moving a single mother's family. When I stepped into their apartment, the most horrid smell reached my nostrils. It was a combination of cat urine, feces, and expired milk. When I went upstairs, the smell intensified, and I had to hold back gagging. I actually had to hold my breath so I wouldn't gag. To this day, this smell remains one of the worst I have ever encountered. Story 97. This fart spray called liquid ass is exactly what it says it is and is a strong prank. Extremely putrid. Story 98. Stayed at my friend's place for a week, so I decided to help her clear out her fridge. I saw a carton of milk that had expired a year ago, so I opened it and poured it down the sink. I immediately felt sick, with tears in my eyes, left the apartment, and called her. She laughed and asked why I would do that. I cleaned her whole kitchen with bleach, opened all the windows, and sprayed everything I could. The smell went away after a few hours, but I could still remember it. Story 99. Dozens of rotting rat corpses were found under a house, poorly masked with pink floral-scented spray in the Florida heat. Story 100. A rabbit died near my front door. It went unnoticed until it smelled terrible. I should have called the city, but I removed it myself. It was the worst smelling thing I have ever encountered. Story 101. A homeless man who had probably not bathed or changed his clothes in 2 months was covered in his own excrement. It was the only time in my life when a smell made me vomit. Story 102. Either rotten coconuts or rotten banana stalks. Having both in the car on the way to the dump was indescribable. Story 103. The infamous smell of death. There was a man across the hall where I used to live who passed away. He had no friends or family and kept to himself. When his time came, he was in there for almost a month. Then suddenly, the apartments got pest control to do a round, and when they opened his door, it had been over for at least 1 month. I stayed at my friend's place downstairs because the smell was so bad. Story 104. Toxic megacolon perforation ranks among the most severe conditions, along with other decompensation-related complications in people at various stages of dying and death. Story 105. A dead body was found inside a house during the summer in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. The windows were covered with flies. Story 106. The roadside washroom was covered from wall to wall and floor to ceiling in urine and feces that had been baking in over 35 degrees Celsius heat on a summer day. There was a lot of dry heaving. Story 107. My friend gave his cat a Viking funeral. Remember when Arnold got thrown outside in Total Recall? Well, it then popped and let out the most horrid mix of decaying gases, burnt hair, and cooking intestines. The worst idea ever. Story 108. Dead body in a hot apartment. Died of natural causes. It is not the smell. It is knowing what the smell signifies that messes with you. Story 109. Slaughterhouse, pork, every Thursday because they slaughtered on Wednesdays. It was downwind from a place where I did volunteer work. I just gagged thinking about it. Story 110. Dead freezer full of meat that I had to toss during my first job after high school. The freezer stopped working several weeks earlier. The meat was not sealed, as most of it was straight from the hunt. It would have been eaten if the freezer had not failed. I had to throw everything into the large dumpster individually until I convinced my boss halfway through that everything needed to go. I was gagging as I threw it away while my boss and coworkers laughed. It was much worse than dealing with dead rats in the wall or cleaning out my friend's grandmother's house. Story 111. Dog anal gland spray. When I had my cesarean section, after they opened me, I could smell my insides. Blood, tissue, and bodily fluids from my uterus. I got a baby out of it. I could never be a doctor. Story 112. Back when I worked at a dog daycare, I had the displeasure of cleaning out a large drain in the middle of one of the large dog playrooms. This was the drain we hosed everything into during daily cleaning, and it was cleared probably 2 or 3 times a year. There was a standing layer of foul-smelling black sludge that you had to reach your hand into to clear debris from. The horrendous smell clung to my hair and skin for days, even after multiple showers. Story 113. Dead pigeons, pigeon droppings, eggs, and dead baby pigeons were found. I cleaned 2 nests from under our solar panels. Definitely not an enjoyable experience. Story 114. I worked in a chicken rendering plant for a year. I never thought I'd get used to the general unpleasant and burning smell that hung over the place, but I eventually did. I thought it was just a cliche or something, but you truly stop smelling it after a while. Anyway, it's a tie between a tanker truck full of chicken blood baking in 90-degree heat or chicken grease if it is made from old awful guts, beaks, hearts, lungs, essentially the insides or parts people don't or can't eat. Story 115. My dog got sprayed by a skunk a few years ago. The skunk smell in the area never bothered me. In fact, I almost liked it. But right in your face? Absolutely horrendous. It happened late at night when almost everything was closed. I went to 3 24-hour CVS stores to get hydrogen peroxide, dish soap, and baking soda to mix up a home remedy. I slept with her in the garage with the door open to keep the smell from entering the house. It was brutal. Story 116. Once at a store I worked at, a customer had such bad diarrhea that we had to evacuate the store and close it. It was about closing time anyway. When our manager came to the store in the morning, it still smelled so bad that he had to put an odor absorber in the toilet and spray half a can of odor eliminator. When I arrived at work at 11, the smell was gone. One of the female cashiers actually threw up outside. Story 117. I was doing a 1-year course in aquaculture at Fremantle Technical and Further Education. The course included work experience at the attached hatchery. One of the 10,000-liter algae tanks had gone off. I had the dubious honor of opening the tank valve and letting it go down the drain. Oh my gosh! I came close to losing my lunch but did not give in to it. I cannot describe it, but never again, thank you. One of the other students cleaned the pipes and pumps over the next few days. I got off easy. Story 118. 2-week-old deceased body behind an auto body shop in the Arizona summer. The smell was noticeable from the street in front of the shop. The body was on the empty back lot. There was no idea why it took so long to report. Story 119. Driving through Central Valley, California farmland where they were burning manure. For miles, we were gasping for breath as our lungs closed up. Story 120. Driving past a car on fire with deceased people inside. The smell lingered at the back of my throat for hours. Story 121. Finally, my time has come. I used to work maintenance at an apartment building in a downtown area. This building had a rooftop deck with a barbecue area and grill. Residents would grill and throw their trash away in the garbage can adjacent to the grill. One fine summer day, someone grilled a bunch of fish and shrimp and threw their trash away. Then it rained. The way the garbage can was set up allowed some of the rainwater to enter the can, where the sun slowly simmered the fish and shrimp trash for a couple of days until we discovered it. Due to poor design, the only way to pull the garbage bag was by taking it down a flight of indoor stairs, down the hall to the elevator, then down 5 floors to the trash room. My partner and I almost threw up. I remember saying, "If any of this gets on me, I'm just done for the day, maybe forever." I didn't get any on me, but the poor resident who tried to catch the elevator down with us turned white and started gagging immediately when the elevator doors opened on her floor. She chose to wait for a different elevator. I can still remember the smell more than 15 years later. It was absolutely incredible. Story 122. I was in Philadelphia last year. I absolutely loved it there, so this is not a criticism of the city. When I was looking for a subway to take, I went down an underground hallway that was closed off. It felt like someone had launched a strong urine odor at me. It was the strongest urine stench I have ever smelled in my life. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.